Hey guys, welcome back to today's video. Today is Thursday, February 18th, 2021, and I've seen a number of comments discussing whether or not Larry Hogan, Chris Sununu, Phil Scott, Republicans from Democratic states, current incumbent Republicans at that could potentially run for president in 2024 because they do offer an alternative perspective to the Republican Party. And today we're going to be talking about how a liberal Republican, someone who is definitely to the left of their counterparts on many issues in my own home state, in specifically northeastern states, and how they would actually perform on the presidential level. I'm not going to be honing in on a specific liberal Republican. Honestly, I wouldn't even say liberal Republican is the right term. Just comparatively to the party, they would be considered liberal. But if you're taking them individually, you would still classify them as a Republican, still classify them as on the right of the political spectrum. But looking at this title, the reason why, this wouldn't really happen is because they wouldn't make it through the primary. In history, when we're taking a look at the historical election results, we've never really seen a nomination of a liberal Republican. Some might argue John McCain. Really? No. Mitt Romney? Absolutely not. For the candidates that, represented the values at their times, they certainly were conservative, if anything. And looking at the election results now, what we are seeing is this discussion is only coming up because of the 2018 election performance and 2020 election performance for some of these Republican governors that come from Democratic states. In many of them, we actually see a higher approval rating amongst the Democratic Party than the Republican Party because these governors, these liberal Republicans, did not vote for Donald Trump. They did not support Donald Trump, and that has been noted and that has been on the record. There are a few exceptions, but looking at the majority of them, Charlie Baker, Phil Scott, Chris Sununu, Larry Hogan, looking at the way that they handled Trump's situation and Donald Trump as a person, none of them were overly enthusiastic with him as the nominee or as president of the United States. But also, the reason why we'd only see this happen in a matchup scenario is because we will never see a liberal Republican nominated unless the Republican Party takes a fundamental shift to the left. And even then, what their leftward shift would still be conservative compared to the country. That's how the Republican Party has maneuvered. The Democratic Party in 2008 is very similar to the modern-day Republican Party now. The fact is, the country has shifted to the left since then, but the Republican Party still serves as that conservative beacon for many Americans. A liberal Republican sort of serves as an oxymoron in today's politics, but this is a prediction where we would be taking a generic liberal Republican and analyzing how they would do on this map. And that's just a little bit backstory about what a liberal Republican is and what you would actually see when we're talking about a liberal Republican. And looking at the entire country, we are still going to see some of the same exact states vote to the right the same way that they have in the past. A lot of the same safe states, a lot of the same likely states. Nothing is really going to fundamentally shift in terms of Republican support. We have to discuss the possibility of crossover support from the Democratic Party, where the liberal Republican might have some strengths and where they might have some weaknesses. And, completely ignore the whole, upsettedness from a primary or just harsh reaction from those members of the Trump wing of the Republican Party or the more conservative wing of the Republican Party. We're not going to be focusing on that. We're not going to be talking about, how much support they would lose if they had made it to the nomination stage. What we are going to be looking at is just, if there was no one else running and a liberal Republican was offering views to independents, Democrats, and Republicans, how would they perform? Which is why Republicans are still going to win a lot of states by a likely and safe margin. But you also have to realize there are areas where we could see a liberal Republican possibly gain more independent voters, possibly some Democratic voters, but also lose support amongst different regions of the country. So main takeaway is a lot of the safe states are going to remain the same. Don't expect a super different type of map, even in terms of safe states that are safe for the Democratic Party. But looking at what we would, be, expecting from a liberal Republican, it really all depends on the candidate. Even a liberal Republican would not make Massachusetts lean or tilt Democratic, at most likely in a very, 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 very good campaign for, I would say, for the Republican candidate then. But looking at a lot of these states, unless they are home state factors, maybe Charlie Baker from Massachusetts, who has a very high approval rating, high 60s, or Larry Hogan in Maryland, high approval rating, high 60s. Unless that happens, and even then, I don't expect them to win the state and maybe just, more competitive than Republicans previously. Looking at a lot of the states in the Northeast, unless there's a home state advantage, I honestly don't think that these races are going to all of a sudden get competitive. And I actually didn't show you the 2018 governor map, but the reason why this is in discussion is because after 2018, despite the national environment being Democrat plus 8 percentage points, the Democrats won the governor popular vote by 3 percentage points in 2018. we still saw states that voted for Hillary Clinton, Maryland, New Hampshire, Vermont, and Massachusetts, all re-elect their Republican governors. Maryland, one of the most Democratic states in the country, voted for Larry Hogan by over 10 percentage points over his Democratic opponent. In Massachusetts, Charlie Baker decimated his Democratic opponent 2-1, one of the most Democratic states in the country as well. Vermont, the most Democratic state in the country, Phil Scott won with 55.4% of the vote. In 2020, he had the largest margin of victory out of any candidate in a statewide race in this region, and also outperformed many people, defeated his incumbent, not his incumbent, but his opponent by 40 percentage points. In neighboring New Hampshire, Chris Sununu won by just around 7 points, won his election bid in 2020 by much, much, much more. So looking at this entire strip, this slew of 4 governors, these are the only ones that really come from states that are overwhelmingly Democratic. New Hampshire is debatable, but for the other 3, absolutely, that are Republicans. And looking at the election performance, they didn't win by small amounts either. Phil Scott won by 15, Chris Sununu won by 7, Charlie Baker won by 33, Larry Hogan won by 11. These were large margins of victory for the most part, at least for a Republican in these states, and for anyone in the state of Massachusetts, or anyone really in the state of Vermont. And looking at 2024, while we won't see this region of the country get competitive, we might see a more competitive nature from possibly New Hampshire or Maine, states that are typically competitive, but definitely not Vermont, not Massachusetts, and not Maryland. These states aren't going to narrow down. So while I do think a liberal Republican might have the upper hand in New Hampshire, and might have, an electoral advantage in Maine, the same way Susan Collins does, I don't think that they would be able to win this state, but I certainly think that it would be more competitive than it would be previously. Looking at the overall support up here, I don't think a liberal Republican would be able to win the 2nd district up in Maine, but the point still remains. I think that they would be able to narrow down the state, win a lot of the vote in the 1st district than the 2nd district, which I find very interesting. But you have to realize that the 2nd district isn't Republican. The 2nd district is not pro-GOP like you might think it is. Looking at that district, I would say, based off the voting block there, they became very pro-Trump. And a liberal Republican certainly isn't pro-Trump. I would say that they are someone who is unenthusiastic, the same way Romney was and McCain was, the same reason why Obama had won this district twice. We can actually take a look at the historical election results. Obama won the 2nd district by 8.6%. Romney could barely crack, didn't even crack 45%. And then in 2016, votes for Trump by 10.3%. A super significant shift, 19-point shift. In 2008, Obama won Maine 2nd district by 11 percentage points. So looking at this area, I still think that it would actually be pretty solid for a Democrat if we're talking about a matchup against a liberal Republican. If anything, I would say that they both would be considered likely and then move Maine at large over into Lean. I think that's actually a better estimation. But I don't expect the liberal Republican number 1 to win in Maine 2nd district, but I expect them to erode a lot of support from that 1st district the same way Susan Collins did. But that's not enough to win the state. Not yet, at least. Looking at that region, narrowed up in both districts, narrowed up, but not enough to win it. But New Hampshire, I could see it happening. But in other regions of the country, a liberal Republican is probably very unenthusiastic, someone who isn't exactly going to rile up the conservative base. And as a result, you're not going to see this Republican able to at least win over states that Donald Trump did. Charisma, enthusiasm, campaign tactic, that's what Donald Trump was able to win by back in 2016 and almost win by in 2020. When he focused a lot of his time and a lot of his effort on key battleground states, he was able to narrow them up right before the election. Wisconsin became very close, decided by less than 1%. Michigan, decided by 3 percentage points. Pennsylvania, decided by 1.2%. These were states that were expected to go to Joe Biden by likely margins at least. They ended up being significantly narrower. And because we're talking about a liberal Republican, I really don't think that this type of support could draw out rural voters the same way that we saw previous, Donald Trump performances or Republicans on the same ballot as Donald Trump do. Down ballot races benefited as a result of Donald Trump being on the ballot, and Donald Trump brought out a lot of voters who did not vote in the 2016 election, did not vote in any election prior to 2020, which is why 2020 was the highest turnout we had seen in a presidential election since 1900, 120 years past. Not a single election with similar turnout. So looking at the regions that I would think that the liberal Republican would do better in, okay, I think that they could do better in Colorado. I think they could do better in states such as New Hampshire. New Hampshire, New Mexico. I don't think it's enough to win it. I certainly don't think it's enough to win it given how partisan the states have become, but I think that they could improve off where Romney did or where McCain did, by no means lose as much as Donald Trump did. And I do think that Donald Trump certainly moved a lot of these states to the left, as well as moving a number of states to the right. So there was sort of that question that, do Republicans want to run Trump again in 2024? He made Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania redder, but he also made Arizona, Texas, and Georgia bluer. So that's a question that they would have to jump around. But a liberal Republican would actually sort of remind me and remind a lot of the American people of someone like Romney, but also with a more tempered tone and a much more bipartisan tone. And I don't think a liberal Republican would be able to, number one, they wouldn't make it through a primary, but I don't think they would be able to easily skate to winning an election. You see, the Democratic Party would return to holding a broad coalition across the Rust Belt. No Republican besides a Trump Republican or Donald Trump himself will be able to do well in this region. While a liberal Republican might be able to win over more voters and win back voters in the southern region of the country and in states that were Bush states and that were previously competitive before Donald Trump or previously solid for the GOP before Donald Trump, I don't think that it would be enough to win back or at least retain the key support that Donald Trump had in regions of the Rust Belt. So I'm thinking, the Rust Belt still returns to the Democratic Party the same way it did in 2020, but we could potentially see a liberal Republican perform well in Arizona, perform well in Georgia, win back these two demographic groups that white suburban voters in the Atlanta metro area, in Maricopa County, the reasons why these two states went to the Democratic Party in 2020. So looking at the advantage for a liberal Republican, I think they could do well in Georgia. I think they could do well in Arizona. I think they could certainly win back a lot of those voters that were lost as a result of Donald Trump's rhetoric and Donald Trump's campaign tactic. But it wouldn't be enough, obviously, to translate that to victories across the Rust Belt. So looking at Georgia, looking at Arizona, I think a liberal Republican could do well here, as well as Texas. I don't think they could do well in the Rust Belt. And also, I do think that there would be a decrease, amount of support that we would see across Iowa, across Ohio, but I still think that a liberal Republican would offer that still enough to win. I don't think it would be an astounding victory like what we saw for Donald Trump, but I think it would still be enough to win in Ohio and Iowa. And I think that they would also I don't know why I didn't characterize Nebraska at large. I think it would also be enough to win Nebraska's 2nd district. You see, there was a lot of vote splitting in 2020. I could expect that to happen in 2024 with a Republican nominee and Joe Biden again. But if we're talking about a liberal Republican, I think they could actually perform well, especially in the Omaha area. And it also depends on redistricting. We have yet to see what happens with that particular 2nd district. But what we could see is the Democratic Party losing that electoral vote that won from Nebraska and Republicans picking it up in this scenario. And I also think that we would see a return to a competitive Virginia, see a constant competitive Nevada. I don't know why I keep confusing the states that start with N. But looking at Nevada, looking at Virginia, these states weren't too solid, I would say, for Nevada's case, but certainly in Virginia for Joe Biden in the 2020 election. But looking at the results so far, I would say a liberal Republican offers some advantages in certain areas, but also offers some disadvantages in others. I think they could narrow states like Virginia and Colorado, New Mexico, and return them to being competitive states how they were previously before the era of Trump. But that would also come with the consequence of Iowa, Ohio, Maine 2nd district, returning back to their stronger Democratic identity, or I would say stronger amount of Democratic support. The Maine 2nd district was a fluke. Iowa and Ohio had voted for the Republican Party before. Bush, however, had not won Maine 2nd district, okay? Looking at the 1992 election results, if we're looking at that as well, what happens in Maine, Maine 2nd district was won by 21.6%. You take a look at 92, it was won by 8.8%. 8.8%. Maine at large won by 8 percentage points. Maine 1st district also won by 8 percentage points. So looking at Maine 2nd district, the fact is Trump was the first Republican to win it since I believe 1988, if I'm not mistaken. Yeah. So Trump certainly had an impact on that region, whereas Iowa and Ohio had previously been competitive. So that's why those are red. That's why Maine's 2nd district is considered to be blue at this point. But, liberal Republican still is a Republican, someone who could still be able to win over the southern region of the country. I still think that we would see a return of those white suburban voters that moved away from Donald Trump because of his language, because of the way that he was handling COVID-19. This would offer North Carolina back to the GOP the same way it was won under Romney, and also a very, very, very narrow victory in Florida, but it's still a victory nonetheless, but ultimately doesn't change the outcome of the result that the liberal Republican, I think, would ultimately come up short of the 270 needed to win the election. While it would be a very close and very contentious electoral map, keep in mind, if you're skipping to the end of the video, keep in mind I'm not factoring in the support lost as a result of a competitive primary. This is assuming, a liberal Republican is cleared, the pathway is cleared, they're just allowing someone like Hogan or Baker or Scott or Sununu to run for office and run for president without any type of contention on the primary level, at least treating it like it's an incumbent or treating it like they are the front runner and they don't have too much primary fall off. What we would see as well, there would be a much more unenthusiastic Republican base. They would still make gains in certain regions of the country that had drawn away from the Republican Party as a result of Donald Trump being the figurehead, but also other regions where they had drawn away from the Democratic Party because of Donald Trump being the figurehead. That's where Democrats would see a return in support, and ultimately we would see a return to be a competitive map that we would have been used to seeing back in 2012. This is an easily believable map for 2012, or even 2008 before Obama was declared the immediate election victory, expected election victory, or a landslide type scenario that we actually saw unfold on election night in 2008. So ultimately, I think the Democratic Party would come up ahead 270 to 268, a very competitive race, a lot of races in contention, a lot of states considered lean, tilt, likely, and solid, bringing us to one of the closest elections in United States history if this was to occur. So thank you guys so much for watching this video. Make sure to comment down suggestions below. Subscribe on the left if you haven't already, and check out the Instagram and Twitter. At the bottom left of the screen, there's also a Discord server for you to go ahead and join. On the screen, there's a video you can watch and then a playlist for my post-2020 election videos. Again, thank you guys so much for watching, and I will see you all tomorrow.